Hello, class. This should be Friday's lesson. This is going to be my second video on World War One. So basically, it's going to be the same as the one y'all saw on Wednesday. I'm going to explain a little as we go, and this one should be about 15 minutes. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're continuing with World War One. World War One was much more than a European conflict, of course, because the name is World War. Australia and Japan, for example, entered the war on the Allies' side, while India supplied troops to fight alongside their British rulers. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Turks and later Bulgaria allied themselves with Germany and the Central Powers. As the war promised to be a grim, drawn-out affair, all the great powers looked for other allies around the globe to tip the balance. They also sought new war fronts on which to achieve victory. All right, so many different countries were either joining Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Central Powers, or they were joining the Allied forces, which means Great Britain, Russia, France, and then eventually the United States, which is going to join 1917. Okay, next part. War affects the world. As the war dragged on, the main combatants looked beyond Europe for a new way to end the stalemate. However, none of the alliances they formed or new battlefronts they opened did much to end the slow and grinding conflict. The Gallipoli Campaign. You could say Gallipoli or Gallipoli, either one's fine. The Gallipoli Campaign, a promising strategy for the Allies, seemed to be to attack a region in the Ottoman Empire known as the Dardanelles. This narrow sea strait was the gateway to the Ottoman capital, Constantinople. Okay, and so you remember from Wednesday that the Ottoman Empire is the modern-day nation of Turkey, and their biggest city, Constantinople, is now known as Istanbul. Hopefully you'll all remember the song Constantinople, Istanbul. I'm not going to sing it, though. Okay, by securing the Dardanelles, the Allies believed that they could take Constantinople, defeat the Turks, and establish a supply line to Russia. The effort to take the Dardanelles Strait began in February 1915. It was known as the Gallipoli Campaign. British, Australian, New Zealand, and French troops made repeated assaults on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the western side of the strait. Turkish troops, some commanded by German officers, vigorously defended the region. By May, Gallipoli had turned into another bloody stalemate. Both sides dug trenches from which they battled for the rest of the year. In December, the Allies gave up the campaign and began to evacuate. They had suffered about 250,000 casualties. Yeah, so it turns out Gallipoli was a defeat for the Allied forces. It's usually associated with Australia because so many Australian soldiers were involved in the campaign. Battles in Africa and Asia. In various parts of Asia and Africa, Germany's colonial possessions came under assault. The Japanese quickly overran German outposts in China. They also captured Germany's Pacific Island colonies. I know it's kind of hard to think that Germany had Pacific Island colonies, but because of World War I, Japan had the justification to take all of those over. English and French troops attacked Germany's 4 African possessions. They seized control of 3. Elsewhere in Asia and Africa, the British and French recruited subjects in their colonies for the struggle. Fighting troops as well as laborers came from India, South Africa, Senegal, Egypt, Algeria, and Indochina. Many fought and died on the battlefield. Others worked to keep their front lines supplied. To be sure, some colonial subjects wanted nothing to do with their European rulers' conflicts. Others volunteered in the hope that service would lead to their independence. This was the view of Indian political leader Mohandas Gandhi, who supported Indian participation in the war. If we would improve our status through the help and cooperation of the British, he wrote, it was our duty to win their help by standing by them in their hour of need. So Mohandas Gandhi is someone that we're going to learn later in the semester who led the nonviolent resistance movement for independence of India from Great Britain. So that was Gandhi. America joins the fight. In 1917, the focus of the war shifted to the high seas. That year, the Germans intensified the submarine warfare that had raged in the Atlantic Ocean since shortly after the war began. In January 1917, the Germans announced that their submarines would sink without warning any ship in the waters around Britain. This policy was called unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans had tried this policy before. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine or U-boat had sunk the British passenger ship Lusitania. The attack left 1,198 people dead, including 128 U.S. citizens. Germany claimed that the ship had been carrying ammunition, which turned out to be true. Nevertheless, the American public was outraged. President Woodrow Wilson sent a strong protest to Germany. After 2 further attacks, the Germans finally agreed to stop attacking neutral and passenger ships. Desperate for an advantage over the Allies, however, the Germans returned to unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. They knew it might lead to war with the United States. They gambled that their naval blockade would starve Britain into defeat before the United States could mobilize. Ignoring warnings by President Wilson, German U-boats sank 3 American ships. In February 1917, another German action pushed the United States closer to war. Officials intercepted a telegram written by Germany's Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, stating that Germany would help Mexico reconquer the land it had lost to the United States if Mexico would ally itself with Germany. So let me stop right there, just to highlight the Zimmermann note. The Zimmermann note is an interesting thing about World War I. The foreign minister of Germany was trying to persuade Mexico into joining with them, and basically, if they had joined, I'm assuming Mexico would have invaded Texas and tried to open up a new front in the World War. Of course, Mexico turned them down, but the sheer thought that Germany was kind of going behind the U.S.'s back and trying to poison, our neighbor to the south, poison Mexico against the United States, it was very unacceptable for the American public, as you could imagine. The Zimmermann note simply proved to be the last straw. A large part of the American population already favored the Allies. In particular, America felt a bond with England. The 2 nations shared a common ancestry and language, as well as similar democratic institutions and legal systems. More important, America's economic ties with the Allies were far stronger than those with the Central Powers. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. The United States entered the war on the side of the Allies. So when it talks about economic ties, what it's not really pointing out in the text is that the United States, they lent a lot of money to Great Britain. We'd given them many loans, and so we weren't about to see millions and billions of dollars of loans go unpaid if on the chance that Great Britain had lost the war. So we weren't going to let that happen. So that's what they're talking about when it talks about economic ties. Okay, war affects the home front. By the time the United States joined the Allies, the war had been raging for nearly 3 years. In those 3 years, Europe had lost more men in battle than in all of the wars of the previous 3 centuries. The war had claimed the lives of millions and had changed countless lives forever. The Great War, as the conflict came to be known, affected everyone. It touched not only the soldiers in the trenches, but civilians as well. Governments waged total war. World War I soon became a total war. This meant that countries devoted all their resources to the war effort. In Britain, Germany, Austria, Russia, and France, the entire force of government was dedicated to winning the conflict. In each country, the wartime government took control of the economy. Governments told factories what to produce and how much. Numerous facilities were converted to munitions factories. Nearly every able-bodied civilian was put to work. Unemployment in many European countries all but disappeared. So many goods were in short supply that governments turned to rationing. Under this system, people could buy only small amounts of those items that were also needed for the war effort. Eventually, rationing covered a wide range of goods, from butter to shoe leather. Governments also suppressed anti-war activity, sometimes forcibly. In addition, they censored news about the war. Censored, of course, means to basically, block it out, any information. Like if a newspaper is censored, it means this newspaper is not allowed to report on certain things. If your mail is censored, it means usually like somebody's taken, like black ink and just marked out what they don't want you to read. Okay. Many leaders feared that honest reporting of the war would turn people against it. Governments also used propaganda, one-sided information designed to persuade, to keep up morale and support for the war. Women and the war. Total war meant that governments turned to help from women as never before. Thousands of women replaced men in factories, offices, and shops. Women built tanks and munitions, plowed fields, paved streets, and ran hospitals. They also kept troops supplied with food, clothing, and weapons. Although most women left the workforce when the war ended, they changed many people's views of what women were capable of doing. Women also saw the horrors of war firsthand, working on or near the front lines as nurses. Here, American nurse Shirley Miller describes her experience with a soldier who had lost both eyes and feet. He moaned through the bandages that his head was splitting with pain. I gave him morphine. Suddenly aware of the fact that he had numerous wounds, he asked, "Say, what's the matter with my legs?" Reaching down to feel his legs before I could stop him, he uttered a heartbreaking scream. I held his hands firmly until the drug I'd given him took effect. Wow. Okay, so the next part is the Allies win the war. With the United States finally in the war, the balance, it seemed, was about to tip in the Allies' favor. Before that happened, however, events in Russia gave Germany a victory on the Eastern Front and new hope for winning the conflict. Russia withdraws. In March 1917, civil unrest in Russia, due in large part to war-related shortages of food and fuel, forced Tsar Nicholas to step down. In his place, a provisional government was established. The new government pledged to continue fighting the war. However, by 1917, nearly 5.5 million Russian soldiers had been wounded, killed, or taken prisoner. As a result, the war-weary Russian army refused to fight any longer. And from my 4th and 9th period classes, you'll remember that's the scene from Dr. Zhivago when all the Russian soldiers say enough is enough, and they desert their positions, they go back to Russia. 8 months after the new government took over, a revolution shook Russia. In November 1917, communist leader Vladimir Ilyich Lenin seized power. Lenin insisted on ending his country's involvement in the war. One of his first acts was to offer Germany a truce. In March 1918, Germany and Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended the war between them. So that was actually the German Secret Service, the German intelligence forces. They had actually been helping Lenin. Lenin was living in exile in Switzerland during most of World War I because he was considered a anti-empire against the Tsar. So his warrant for arrest was out there, but he was living in exile in Switzerland, and it was the German Secret Service who smuggled him back into Russia via, I believe it was Finland. So he enters Russia and he stirs things up. He gets people riled up against the emperor's government, the Russian government. The Germans knew that if Lenin took power in Russia, the Russians would stop fighting, and that would have been a huge victory for the Germans, which it was. But eventually Germany's going to lose in the West anyway. Okay. The Central Powers collapse. Russia's withdrawal from the war that at last allowed Germany to send nearly all its forces to the Western Front. In March 1918, the Germans mounted one final massive attack on the Allies in France. As in the opening weeks of the war, the German forces crushed everything in their path. By late May 1918, the Germans had again reached the Marne River. Paris was less than 40 miles away. Victory seemed within reach. By this time, however, the German military had weakened. The effort to reach the Marne had exhausted men and supplies alike. Sensing this weakness, the Allies, with the aid of nearly 140,000 fresh U.S. troops, launched a counterattack. In July 1918, the Allies and Germans clashed at the Second Battle of the Marne. Leading the Allied attack were some 350 tanks that rumbled slowly forward, smashing through the German lines. With the arrival of 2 million more American troops, the Allied forces began to advance steadily toward Germany. So it's the American troops who make all the difference in the war. We had enough fresh troops ready to break basically the front lines of where the Germans were. Soon the Central Powers began to crumble. First the Bulgarians and then the Ottoman Turks surrendered. In October, revolution swept through Austria-Hungary. In Germany, soldiers mutinied and the public turned on the Kaiser. The Kaiser, of course, it's the German word for Caesar, the emperor. So the Germans were turning against the emperor. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II stepped down. Germany declared itself a republic. A representative of the new German government met with French commander Marshal Foch in a railway car near Paris. The two signed an armistice, or an agreement to stop fighting. On November 11th, World War I came to an end. So basically, an armistice, it's one of those words you have to know, especially for U.S. history. An armistice means the ceasefire, the ceasing of all combat operations between the two sides. In this case, though, is really more of a surrender. The Germans have surrendered. Oh yeah, and fun fact, November 11th is Veterans Day. That's why we celebrate it on November 11th. It's the end of World War I, 1918. All right, let me read real quick about the legacy of the war. World War I was in many ways a new kind of war. It involved the use of new technologies. It ushered in the notion of war on a grand and global scale. It also left behind a landscape of death and destruction such as was never before seen. Both sides in World War I paid a tremendous price in terms of human life. About 8.5 million soldiers died as a result of the war. Another 21 million were wounded. In addition, the war led to the death of countless civilians by way of starvation, disease, and slaughter. Taken together, these high casualty rates spell tragedy, an entire generation of Europeans wiped out. The war also had a devastating economic impact on Europe. The Great Conflict drained the treasuries of European countries. One account put the total cost of the war at $338 billion, a staggering amount for that time. The war also destroyed acres of farmland as well as homes, villages, and towns. The enormous suffering that resulted from the Great War left a deep mark on Western society as well. A sense of disillusionment settled over the survivors. The insecurity and despair that many people experienced are reflected in the art and literature of the time. Another significant legacy of the war lay in its peace agreement. As you will read in the next section, the treaties to end World War I were forged after great debate and compromise, and while they sought to bring a new sense of security and peace to the world, they prompted mainly anger and resentment. Oh yeah, so it's one of the great lessons about World War I history. After it was over, they tried to put things in place that would prevent another world war from happening, but they failed miserably. And of course, what's going to happen in 1933, Adolf Hitler comes to power in Nazi Germany, and turns it into Nazi Germany, and World War II is going to begin in 1939. So roughly about 21 years after World War I ended. Okay, so that's all we have for today. Let me go ahead and stop. Thank you guys.